Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Mystery Mondays. As always, before we get into the video, make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you do enjoy this series and want me to make more, and let's just go ahead and get into it. So today we're going to be talking about the Keddie murders. On April 11th in 1981, a quadruple homicide took place in Keddie, California. It happened in cabin 28, which Sue Sharp and her 5 children had been renting out since November in 1980. Late at night on the 11th of April, or in the very, very early hours of the next day, on the 12th of April, Glenna Sue Sharp, who was known as Sue commonly, who was 36, her son John, who was 15, and his friend Dana, who was 17, were all murdered. It wasn't until sometime after the three were discovered that Sue's daughter Tina, who was 12, was missing. And it wasn't until 1984 when Tina's skull and fragments of her bones were found. In 1979, Sue and her 5 children had been kicked out of their home in Connecticut by her abusive husband, James Sharp. Sue and her children had to move across the country. They were visiting and living and staying with friends and family for a few months until Sue managed to rent a trailer in Quincy, which her brother had just left. In November of 1980, Sue managed to move her family from the very, very small trailer they were staying in to a much larger cabin in Keddie. They were staying in cabin 28 and they had 3 bedrooms in which they all fit in a lot nicer than in the trailer. Sue was still struggling to make ends meet because, as far as anyone knew, she was only making the $250 a week that the Navy provided her. So moving on to the day of the murder, John, her son, and his friend Dana had been spending the day together. They were seen walking along State Route 70 during the day and returned to the cabin late at night. Apparently they returned at about 12 o'clock. It's not clear whether they got home while the murders were taking place or they went down to the basement and they came up to see what all the commotion was and ended up getting involved in the murder that way. I think the first option is more likely though, and we'll get into that in a minute. The next day at 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp, which was Sue's daughter, was on her way home. She had slept at the neighbor's house that night. She was coming home so that she could get clothes to go to church with her neighbors, but unfortunately that's not what ended up happening. When she got home, she discovered the bodies of Sue, Dana, and John in the cabin's living room. The crime scene was very gruesome and the body, which was furthest away, was covered with a blanket. Sheila also noticed that there was a knife between the entrance and the closest body, and she said that it was really bent, which obviously means that the murders were brutal enough for them to have bent this knife so badly that at first she didn't even notice that it was a knife. Sheila, understandably shocked, ran back to her neighbors to tell them what had happened. Sheila and Mrs. Seabolt, who was the neighbor, went to the closest phone and immediately called the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. They then went back to the scene of the crime and found that there was 3 boys still in their room. Greg, Rick, and also the neighbor's son, Justin Smart, were all in the room. Luckily, they were unharmed, so Mrs. Seabolt and Sheila both helped get them out through the bedroom window. Greg and Rick, apparently they had slept through the entire thing, but Justin was woken up by a loud noise, so he ended up becoming the only witness of this crime, but I'm gonna go ahead and get into that in a second. So upon further inspections from investigators, they found that the bodies had been bludgeoned, strangled, and stabbed to death. And also the bodies had been struck by 2 different hammers of 2 different sizes. So Sue had been bludgeoned to death with a Daisy Powerline 880 rifle, and Dana had been strangled to death manually, like someone's hands, they had manually strangled her. Sue's body, which was the furthest away from the door, was covered with a blanket which was actually from Tina's bed. So her wrists were tied loosely with some medical tape, but on top of the loosely tied medical tape was a very tight loop of electrical cord. The cord was actually connected, like went from her wrist to her ankles and tied her ankles up as well, although she did have another wire tying her ankles together as well. Sue was also gagged with a bandana and her own underwear, and then she had several layers of medical tape on top of that. Dana was in the middle of Sue and John, and her head was kind of like resting on one of the pillows from the couch, and John's hands, John was the closest to the door, his hands were on his abdomen and they were tied really tightly with medical tape. They were also tied by white cloth, but the cloth, I think it was, appeared to be a little bit broken. His ankles were also taped twice with the medical tape, but then they once had a loop of electrical cord over them. And the cord that was linked to his ankles was also linked to Dana's ankles. There was tape around one of Dana's boots and then half a loop of tape around her other boot, and the full loop around her right boot was also broken, kind of like the one around John's hands. There were various weapons that were found at the scene of the crime. They found a kitchen knife, a butcher knife, they found one of the hammers which was all bloodied, but they never found the rifle that was used to kill Sue. They also later found some other evidence like another knife and a hammer later in the investigation, I guess. It was very, very close to the scene of the crime in Keddie. They found it in a trash bin. And despite the fact that dogs had been brought in to sniff the entire area a few days after the murders had taken place, they didn't find Tina's skull until 3 years later and 29 miles away from the scene of the crime. Okay, so now I'm gonna go back to Justin because he was the only witness of the crime. So Justin, despite the fact that he was young, did provide a statement to police. He was actually really confusing because he provided his first statement, which was like a dream that he said that he had. I will provide a link down below so you guys can read about the dream because I'm not going to go through it, because if I did, this video would be a million hours long. But then he ended up having to do a lie detector test, and in the lie detector test, that's when he was like, no, the dream wasn't real, I actually saw the murders, I was awake. And then he ended up changing his story again later on when he was an adult, but I actually couldn't find the statement from when he was an adult, so I'm going to tell you guys the one from when he was a kid and what he said. So first he says that he heard a noise which woke him up, so then he went into the doorway to basically see what was happening and see what the noise was. So from his doorway, it like basically peeked into the living room, and he said that he saw Sue was lying on the couch and that there were two men standing in the center of the room. So then John and Dana came in through the front door, and John started arguing with the two men and they started fighting, and Dana then tried to get away. She tried to run through the kitchen and go out through the back, I believe, which is when one of the men who had brown hair apparently hit John with the hammer. Sue then runs over to John, and that is apparently when Justin went back into his room and hid behind the door. And apparently at the same time that Justin went to hide in the room is when the two men tied John and Dana up. Apparently Tina then came out of her room after being woken by all of the noise. She was carrying her blanket and she asked what was happening. And that is when the two men grabbed her by the arms and they took her out through the back door of the kitchen. And then one of the men came back in and covered Sue with the blanket that Tina had from her bed. So that's all of Justin's statements. It's pretty confusing, and I feel like a lot of the things that he said are kind of conflicting, I guess. Maybe he just didn't know what was happening because he was trying to hide and he didn't see the whole thing. But what was conflicting was basically John and Dana come back, and it seems like Sue is already hurt because John is trying to defend her, yelling at these two men. But then when John is hit, Sue comes over to him, even though it seemed like she was, you know, John was defending her because she was hurt, but then she managed to run over him. I don't know, it was pretty confusing, Justin's statements, but I guess some of what he said kind of makes sense. Okay, so now let's get back to the officers. I feel like the way that I'm telling this one is really confusing, but I didn't know how else to mention it because there is just so much evidence. So at 8 a.m, the first officer, Hank Clement, arrived at the scene and had a little search around the cabin. At 8:25 a.m, the second officer, Jerry Shaveman, then arrived at the scene and he had a look around the scene as well and then started interviewing witnesses. At around 8:30 a.m, Don Story was called and he was asked to report a triple homicide. At 8:45 a.m, Don Davis, who was Sue's brother, met with Shaver and told him about Sue and the divorce and everything that he knew. He also told Shaver how Jim, Sue's estranged husband, had not visited the house at all, and since she moved in November of 1980, she hadn't given Jim any of the addresses, phone numbers, or anything like that, so he hasn't been able to come and see them or contact them or anything like that. When the last two detectives arrived at 9:30 a.m, they started to photograph the crime scene and collect all of the evidence. They did a house-by-house check of everyone in the area that lived in the cabins, and they also investigated the crime scene for several days. Not all of the crime reports are available, but the ones that are do not match up. They all have different stories, and it seems like something really strange is going on there. It's not only stories that don't match up, but the facts in the crime reports also do not match up. And apparently Story's report had been doctored because he showed on his report apparently that they did not know of Tina's disappearance. Despite being told about it by Justin, they still didn't believe him and didn't know about the disappearance until like 12 hours later after they got to the crime scene, scene, so they doctored the report to make it seem like they did know about it. I'm gonna link below a website which shows a bunch of timelines and stuff like that, so you guys can check them out, because if I went through them, there's a lot of them, so obviously this video would be way too long. It would be like 10 hours long, so I'm just gonna link that down below so that you guys can read it for yourselves. At around noon, a helicopter flew around the area to survey the area, get photos and everything like that, and apparently they saw two men who they think to be the killers. They actually got this on video, and they were exiting town through the back way so that nobody saw them and they didn't get caught. So overall, the police did a really shitty job on this, which kind of makes it seem like this was some kind of police cover-up maybe. They didn't listen to Justin, first of all, so they didn't believe him about the fact that Tina was missing, which could have been detrimental to finding her. I mean, if the helicopter did see these two guys who could have been the killers, the fact that they didn't listen to him and didn't even bother to look for Tina for so long after she disappeared and so long after the murders, it just could have like meant everything towards finding her. If they had just believed him, maybe they would have found her. They also didn't secure the crime scene properly, and a lot of evidence was ruined when rain seeped into the sheriff's office and contaminated so much of the evidence. So there were actually several suspects in this case. I didn't read up on all of them because I couldn't find a lot of info, besides the fact these two main suspects who were actually neighbors. So Marty Smart was one of them, which was Justin's father, and he was a friend to the local sheriff, a close friend to him at that, and he was obviously a neighbor. He lived 2 cabins away from Sue, I believe, and that was alongside this guy named John, who had recently moved in with Marty. So both of these men had criminal records and obviously lived very close to the crime scene. Apparently Marty was actually angry at Sue at the time because she was like interfering in his marriage with Marilyn. So Marty was married to Marilyn, they were having marital problems, and Sue was kind of getting involved and telling Marilyn that he needed to leave Marty because their relationship was just really rocky and not great. Apparently they did end up divorcing sometime later. On top of that, it's possible from what I've read that John was actually mad at Sue for not coming out with them. A hammer that was found near the crime scene in the trash bin that I was talking about earlier at the Keddie general store, that matched the description of a hammer that Marty had apparently lost. And the hammer was believed to be the murder weapon. There was also a letter found that was written from Marty to his wife Marilyn. It was found by an investigator named Mike Gamberg. The letter basically said, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I have bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through." Marilyn says she does not remember receiving this letter. She's never seen it, she's never read it, but she does say that the handwriting looks a lot like Marty's. Now what sucks about all of this info is the investigator Mike Gamberg, he actually only found all of this out in about 2010. He reopened the case in 2010 because when the actual murders happened, he wasn't allowed on the case. They actually told him if he looked into it that he would be fired. So from this, it seems like 1, this definitely could have been a cover-up because they know that this guy would have looked into it and that's why they threatened to fire him if he did. And 2, the police did just such a shitty job at looking for this, especially if this guy Mike could find all of this out so many years later. The police obviously did such a shitty job in 1981 when this actually happened that they could have arrested someone for this. But now, by the time that Mike has started looking into this case, the 2 suspects, Marty and John, had both died. Marty died as late as 2006, so both of the prime suspects are now dead. So there are some other theories, but I feel like most of them don't hold as much weight as the whole Marty thing. The first one is that this was a drug deal gone bad, and that maybe Sue was involved with Marilyn, Marty, and John in a drug deal, and it just did not go well. But the information I found on this was super confusing, and I feel like it'll just confuse you guys as well, and to me, I just don't think this is a theory even worth thinking about. So the next theory is that this had everything to do with Tina. It's possible that Tina was being sexually abused by John, and he did not want anyone to find out. Maybe Sue found out about it and threatened to go to the authorities, and that is why they did this. They took Tina instead of killing her because if he was sexually abusing her, maybe he wanted to continue to do that, and that is why they took Tina, killed Sue, and then they killed Dana and John because John and Dana walked in the middle of it and then had to kill them so that they weren't witnesses. It's possible that they took Tina as a trophy as well, but I feel like the first option is a lot more logical. The fact that they took her because she was being sexually abused. Whatever the reason was for the murders, I definitely think Marty and John are the culprits. I definitely think they did it. Obviously, it's really hard to prove now that both of them have passed away. Who else could have done it? There's no real other like true suspects to this case. Sue's wife that I talked about earlier, obviously he had an airtight alibi. They said there is no way that he could have done it. On top of that, he didn't know where they lived. He didn't have their phone number. He didn't have anything like that. He hadn't talked to them in a very, very long time. And obviously, as I said, he had an alibi, so there's no way that he did it. But let me know what you guys think about this case. I would love to hear in the comments what you think. I always love talking to you guys about it and hearing. If you have any more information, of course, let me know that down below, or any theories that you have that I didn't mention. I would love to hear them. As always, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and hopefully I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!